I'm always a little overawed when I'm asked to speak in the presence of such profound reform efforts, because New Zealand is a tiny little nation in the middle of nowhere, and we only have 4 million people, and we have the incredible advantage of working off the basis of 100 years of meritocratic and politically neutral appointments in our public service, and it's an incredible luxury. So I really think the responsibility of New Zealand in that context is to try and experiment with things that others might not have the opportunity or the luxury to do. So I'm just going to very, very briefly contextualise my comments in terms of the reform that I've been leading over the last 5 years, but then I want to pick up a couple of examples of middle managers in our system now and how their life has changed and how their role is now a lot more difficult and complex than it used to be, which I think will draw off some of the themes of the earlier presentations and then bring us back down into that space of what does this actually mean for the individuals who are trying to make this happen. So the themes of New Zealand's reform, although we're in a very different space, the themes are very common. So our big issues over the last 3 to 4 years have been results, stewardship, and system leadership. So results is the fact there are some complex cross-cutting issues in our society which we're not very good at dealing with. So you prioritise them, you identify, you make someone responsible for them, you put the Prime Minister in charge of them, and then you get on and you try and deal with them. Stewardship is about being longer term. We have a 3-year electoral cycle. We're a very, very good system at delivering to the Minister of the day in terms of their priorities, but we're not so good at looking to the medium term. So we've been very focused on stewardship. And then the third thing is system leadership, because we drank the Kool-Aid on new public management more than anyone else in the world, which meant that we have this remarkably efficient system, but it's very fragmented. So we've had to reconceptualise how we work as a system on the issues that really matter. And we've done a lot of enabling change. I spent a lot of time changing the rules of the system to make that happen. But now what we're struggling with is the behavioural flow on from that. So, of course, changing the rules in the system changes nothing if people don't actually use those rules in a different way. And that's the space we're now in. And if I was giving a different speech, I'd get off into what our reform is now about. And our reform is now about integrated information to support integrated decision-making and service delivery and investment-driven budgeting. That's another conversation for another day. But it is continuing to add to the complexity of the environment we're operating in. What I want to do is pick a couple of roles that have been created by our reform environment and just investigate briefly the dilemmas that we leave those people in. So I've picked middle manager type roles. So these aren't our chief executives, although we've made their jobs more complex too, and nor are they the absolute frontline worker, although we're asking a lot more of them. So my first space is a functional leadership space, or horizontal leadership as it was talked about over there. So we've radically increased the power of our government chief information officer. So that's our person in charge of ICT for the whole of government and for our utilisation of information. Incredibly important cross-cutting horizontal power in a system that up until recently just largely asked every department to do their ICT investment separately, so they all built crappy systems that didn't interact with each other effectively and fell over half of the time. So we said, well, that's no good anymore. We need integrated systems as a whole. We need a platform that government can work off. We need it to be interoperable with our partners outside the government sector. So we need to integrate this. So we thought that's great. We'll set up a government chief information officer, and they'll enable us to do all of these things that are up here on the wall. And that's all very well and good, but my team was responsible for all the mandating and setting up of that. And then we sat down in a meeting with the Prime Minister and the Government Chief Information Officer, and he gave the Government Chief Information Officer 2 simultaneous messages. On one hand, he said, don't stuff up. We'd recently had a major IT project that had fallen over in our education sector, and the Prime Minister said, not on my watch, not again. God, this has been painful. Don't stuff up. So you as head of ICT for government are responsible that no one else falls over in terms of their IT budget projects. And then he said, this is the absolute transformative opportunity in my government, so capture the opportunity. So this dilemma of sitting in front of the Prime Minister, on one hand having him say, don't mess anything up, and on the other hand, this is the great transformational change of a generation, don't miss the opportunity. And how that's played back down into the Government Chief Information Officer and his team then trying to implement that for government's really difficult. And they get trapped between their role in assurance and their role in transformation. So on one hand, they've had to invest very heavily in an infrastructure around assurance in terms of making sure that people are setting up their ICT projects right, spending their money in the right way, realising their benefits, and working on an interoperable basis and making sure they don't stuff up. But then on the other hand, they see themselves as the vanguard of transformation in terms of helping agencies to truly reconceptualise how they do business. And we don't have public servants who are really good at wearing both of those hats at once. In fact, they're really hard to come by. It's not just a public service issue, it's a broader sectoral issue. I mean, it's the same. The reality is most of the people who are working in the GCI office, we've stolen from the private sector in terms of particularly working in large banking sectors and that sort of thing. And they have the same dilemma in terms of how do you get those two things to operate effectively? And it really, really matters because on one hand, this is a function that has incredible ability to speed up change in the system, or it has incredible ability to slow the system down. Because if they pull too hard on the assurance lever, on the trying to keep a check on everything, then everything gets slowed down. And we don't realise the opportunity for change. So they're really struggling with their definition of whether they are a central control function or whether they are a standardising platform to enable others to build innovation off their back. So I don't have an answer for you. This is a work in progress example. In terms of when you're a middle manager sitting in Colin McDonald, he's the GCIO's team, and you're sitting there and you have both of these jobs at once. And you know you have to generate a common platform for government. And so you know there's a level of standardisation that you have to drive, but you know that if you get the standardisation too far, then you will undermine the bespoke ability to deliver the services to citizens that are really required. We know that we need interoperability within the public service, but we ultimately know that many of the services that we now care about are being delivered across multiple sectors. So we're already behind in not being integrated within the core public service, but we know that's not the goal. The goal is actually to have interoperability beyond those barriers, which gets beyond your ability to direct and control and gets into your ability to influence and bring people together around common objectives, which again is not a skill set that 10, 20 years ago, we were highly rewarding in our public service. And the other thing that they really struggle with is fixed long-term planning versus adaptability. Because we know by definition what we're thinking about now on ICT is already defunct. There's nothing more certain than that the New Zealand public service is not at the cutting edge of ICT. And so the very fact that we're working on it now means that it's yesterday's technology. Now, that's just the reality. We're going to be fast followers rather than innovators in an ICT space. But it also means that if you're locking in your long-term plan for the next 10, 20 years about what you're going to build, you're stuffed. And you're stuffed before you get there. And again, that's not a skill set that we've been good at, that rapid adaptable change. So we just say to someone, you've come out of it, whether you've come out of a private sector or a public sector background, you might have been a chief financial officer for chief technology officer for an organisation, you might have built ICT systems, you might have come from an assurance background, and then we say, okay, we want you to go into a department, we want you to mess with the primary engine of their business change at the moment. You've got a direct prime ministerial mandate for telling them whether they can green light or red light what they're doing, and by the way, they're not allowed to stuff up, and you're responsible if they don't get transformational change. That's really hard. It's all of these things in action, but it's really hard. And we're not winning on that at the moment. The big complaint inside the system is that they're too assurance-focused because they're inevitably risk-averse in terms of their tendency to put the Prime Ministers don't stuff up first. And so the accusation is that they're slowing down transformational change in the system when the very reason the office was created in the first place was to drive transformational change at a faster pace. And at base, that comes down to our ability to build the right sort of capability that can make decisions as an individual in an incredibly complex space that affect a great range of public servants operating around them. So that's one example. The other example I wanted to use was more on a service provision side, and it's a bit of a tale of two cities. So one of our Prime Minister's result areas around vulnerable kids. And that's because New Zealand performs really well internationally, a whole lot of indicators, but we've got this real blip around vulnerable kids, in particular groups of vulnerable kids in our population who do very poorly. So we've set up children's actions teams. They're sort of standard sort of response to this sort of environment where you say, in a local area, we will empower a leader in that local environment in this town or this city, and they will gain the ability to coordinate and direct to a certain degree the services related to vulnerable children in that geography on the basis that they will be better positioned to tailor those services to the needs of that community than the national administrator or even the sort of provincial head in that sense. And so we've got a range of children's actions team, and so they will, the person in charge of that children's action team will have the enviable task of trying to bring together education and health and justice and police and housing and social development and public and private and non-government providers to say what's the right way of intervening in this community to get better outcomes for our kids. So wonderful idea. Really hard to implement, of course, in a system in which you've traditionally had siloed public services. They're constructed on completely different basis. You've got different delegations, which is my favourite. So when you're trying to do this in the province, you've got the district health board representative from the health system who can make decisions about X and Y. You've got the regional director of your social development thing who can only make decisions about A and B. And then you've got the local representative of the head office of the centralised social development project who can make decisions about nothing at all. And then you're trying to use that as a mechanism for driving your local service provision. So what's really interesting about that is some of these work and some of them don't. So we have one in Whangarei, it's in the far north of New Zealand, that is absolutely going gangbusters. Transformational, astonishing turnaround in results in an 18-month period. We've got another one just down the road in Rotorua, very similar social and ethnographic makeup, and rubbish results, almost achieving nothing at all. And so just one observation, because I can't give you an absolute answer about that, but we know that what we're asking the people to do that we put in that space is the big thing we've done in our reforms in New Zealand is we've detached mandate and power from expectation. So New Zealand was obsessed after new public management with the idea that your accountability had to exactly match the area of your responsibility and that you were responsible for driving it and you could be held accountable for everything you did because you had the power to drive it. We know that's a nonsense now. We know all the things we want to get done that really matter. That doesn't work for, and the children's actions teams are just like that. So the amount of power that the head of a children's action team leader has compared to what we're asking them to do, it is a massive imbalance, which means they have to compensate for that with their leadership style, with their influencing ability, and with their ability to use soft skills to bring together a community and harness the power of that community to get done what they're going to get done. They can never do it through hierarchical command and control. So the difference you have between Whangarei and Rotorua is what happened with the initial leadership of that program. In Whangarei, you had an inspirational local leader who had a great team around them who was able to bring together those resources and build early confidence. Early confidence led to subsequent wins, and you got a positive cycle going on. And Rotorua, pretty similarly skilled team in a way, but they didn't get early confidence in the community. Now, the problem wasn't that. The problem was what head office then did, because head office was used to being head office. So the moment they weren't getting good results out of Rotorua, on the equivalent of day 3, they stepped in and they said, okay, this isn't working, we're stepping on top of you, we're stopping you from doing what you need to do. And it's taken us 18 months to get Rotorua back to square one from the point at which a head office that had no idea what it was really doing intervened in a space that just needed some time to get to where it was going. And that's about this sort of thing about risk aversion and your ability to give people the space to fail. I mean, this thing about skiting, about failure, which we're rubbish at in that sense. And Rotorua just needed to fail a bit before it was going to succeed. So those are my two examples, and they're not solutions, they're problems. They're problems in terms of, well, you say we want to do all this, we say we create these roles, but we don't currently have a sufficient pipeline to serve the complexity of roles that we're creating. So my lovely theoretical model for how we're going to run our system, and it is a beautiful model, it's really lovely, when you actually try and put it on the ground and get people to operate in it, are we just asking too much of people? How do we get people into that space? Now, just not to leave you in a complete conundrum, I'll just come around in 1 minute on my final theme. Every time I come and see Max, I talk about my sort of growing thought patterns about what I want to replace new public management with. So I want to replace new public management with new public passion, which is this, New Zealand was responsible for a lot of new public management successes. So I think it should be our responsibility to come up with a bit of replacement for it. So this is new public passion for me, is this idea that if you are going to ask people to operate in that sort of space, you have to enable them in a quite different way. And new public management comes from a massive over-reliance on extrinsic motivation, on the idea that you can use managerialism and strong accountability incentives to drive people towards a certain type of performance. The spirit of devolved leadership, of it being across the organisation. I'm a huge believer in that. My philosophy and my team is everybody leads and all of that. But at transitional moments, leadership really matters. The person you have in the leadership role at the point at which the system has not reached the maturity that you can wrap around that leader and support them, and they are having to break through the barriers, it really matters. It really matters who's in that role and whether they have the resilience and the capability and the networks to enable them to break through those barriers. So that's an observation where we've we have an over tendency to rely on heroic leadership still in terms of some of our change processes, but also a recognition that some degree of that type of leadership is required when you're in the middle of a change process. In terms of getting out the other side of it, because we know we can't scale heroic leadership, and it is not the solution for fixing the problems in our system, we are very focused at the moment on trying to generate, we've just relaunched our second leadership success profile for the system, which has been very much a process of trying to draw off where we're seeing leadership success in the system and then trying to map that in terms of an actual set of skills and competencies that are specifically designed for our changing environment. I think the main thing that's notable about that is that the last one only came out 18 months ago, and we've just redone it, which really surprised us. That's not what we expected. When we did the last one, we sort of thought that was a leadership profile for the next 5 to 10 years. And here we are 18 months on, and we're like, oh, well, that was a real step forward, but it's not right. And we're finding that the demand of leadership, that the things that were not in there was a lot about collaboration. This guy was pushing on that really hard, but there was an aspect around customer centricity that just didn't come through adequately in our profile from 18 months ago. And there was an aspect around talent management that we'd just really underdone in our system in terms of the vitality of having the leader who wasn't just the lone heroic leader, but was the heroic leader who trained other people in that sort of form of leadership style so that you could scale, and then building that back into leadership profile to say, that's what we want. And what we're doing at the moment, which is really innovative for us, although I know other systems have done it for a while, is we're building that profile into all of our recruitment at first and second tier in the public service, and we're running a common assessment tool across all of our senior civil service so they are all assessed against that profile in terms of their gap. And that's not a performance tool, that's a development tool in terms of where they're going. So it's something we're struggling with.